Hello and welcome to our training on classroom success and behaviour management. This training is designed as part 2, so I'd recommend that you've participated in the part 1 training or that you have a good basic understanding of behaviour and the behaviour functions before taking this course. So our aims for today are to review why behaviour occurs, to look at the principles of reinforcement and the function of behaviour. We're also going to look at how we stop behaviours from occurring. We're going to review the principles of punishment and the schedules of reinforcement. We're going to consider how your reaction is affecting the child's behaviour, thinking about the importance of proactive strategies and selecting the right strategy based on the child you're working with, and then talk about how to measure success and how to know the intervention we've implemented is working. It's really important to take data to monitor success so you know when to make changes. So, brief review, why do behaviours occur? All behaviours happen for a reason and all behaviour is learned. Behaviours occur because they serve a purpose. They allow a person to get their wants and needs met, and they continue to occur because they are effective. Repeated practice of the same behaviour, meeting the same outcome, will result in a behaviour being learned. The behaviour itself may change slightly, with trial and error over time, to maximise its efficacy, but it will still occur. So in terms of the phrase, all behaviours happen for a reason, behaviours happen because they meet a certain need or desire, and there are generally 4 main functions of behaviour. These fall into the categories of escape or avoid, normally for a less preferred activity, to gain access to a tangible item or preferred activity, to gain access to attention, or for internal pleasure. And generally most behaviours we engage in can be categorised into one of these 4 functions. And this occurs for both good behaviours and bad behaviours. I know you can't see me, but I'm doing good behaviours in inverted commas because we're looking in terms of good behaviours as appropriate, positive behaviours, and bad behaviours as kind of challenging, inappropriate behaviours. So if we look at the function of escape, behaviours which occur to avoid a less desirable item, activity, or event are said to be maintained by escape. These behaviours continue to happen because they are successful in escaping or avoiding a task, often a task that is less preferred, and they are often easier than completing the specific task at hand. So if you think of examples in your own life, if you've got a big long to-do list at work, you might engage in behaviours such as making a cup of tea, going to the bathroom. All of these behaviours result in you avoiding or prolonging the inevitable work that you have to do, and they're actually easier than doing the work themselves. So these behaviours such as making tea and going to the bathroom are actually reinforced by escape from the less preferred activities on its do list. Tangible maintained behaviours are behaviours which occur to gain access to a preferred item, activity, or event. And these behaviours continue to happen because they're successful in gaining access to a preferred item. So if you think in terms of 2 children playing in the play area, one child walks up to another, they snatch a toy off the other child, they gain access to that toy, they get to play with it. This behaviour of snatching has been served the function of tangible access and has been maintained by the fact that the child got access to that toy. It was easy, it was quick, it worked, it was effective. Attention maintained behaviours. So behaviours which occur to gain access to attention or to avoid unwanted attention. These behaviours continue to happen because they're successful in gaining some form of attention from others. This may be as simple as a laugh from the friends when the teacher tells you off, or being part of the in crowd. Attention maintained behaviours are often overlooked or misunderstood, and also thinking in terms of the fact that attention might not always be positive attention. Attention could be a reprimand, it could be, when you get told off and everyone laughs at you and it's funny, and that attention is enough to maintain it. It could be a reaction, it could be, when I do something inappropriate, my peers kind of look shocked and surprised, and that reaction is really good fun. Those kind of sometimes negative attention in terms of the fact that it's not necessarily good attention, it's not necessarily positive attention, but it's attention nonetheless, and it might serve the function of reinforcing the behaviour. And then finally, automatic maintained behaviours, or behaviours that occur for internal pleasure. So these are behaviours which occur because they result in a pleasant internal sensation or to avoid a less pleasant internal sensation. These behaviours continue to happen because they are successful in providing some form of internal feedback or pleasant sensation, and they can be hard to work with because the reinforcement itself happens naturally as soon as the behaviour occurs. So these are examples such as flicking a pen in class, doodling on the table. They serve no real purpose other than the fact that they're kind of fun to do, they're easy, you get some kind of sensation and some kind of feedback for them. So it's important to remember that when you're looking at behaviours and why they're occurring, behaviours increase because they have been met with reinforcement. And likewise, behaviours will reduce if they're met with punishment. It's important at this point to understand that punishment is not talking about any kind of aversive negative consequences. We're not talking about corporal punishment or any kind of real aversive restrictive practices. We're simply talking about the fact that when a behaviour isn't successful or it doesn't result in the function that you're looking for, it won't happen again and it's said to be punished. So back to my example earlier, if the child that walked up to the peer snatched a toy off them, the peer snatched it back and hit them, that behaviour wasn't successful in meeting the child's needs. They didn't gain access to the toy they wanted. The behaviour was punished by the fact that the other child took the toy back and hit them around the face. Next time that child wants a toy, you'd assume they're probably not going to go about it in quite the same way. They might try a slightly different tactic rather than snatching the toy because it didn't work last time round. Likewise, for the attention seeker in the class, if they're telling a joke and they're clowning around and none of their peers laugh because they're busy doing their own work, that behaviour wasn't successful in gaining attention. It's been punished because it didn't meet the reinforcement that the child was looking for, the child was hoping for. And again, next time around when the child wants to gain attention, they might do it in a slightly different way. Real world examples include a speeding fine. If you're caught speeding, you get a fine. This should punish the behaviour, you'll stop speeding again. If you're on an Atkins diet and you don't actually lose any weight, you're probably going to stop doing the Atkins diet. These behaviours are said to be punished because they haven't met the outcome you wanted, or because they were met with some kind of extrinsic punishment or kind of penalty, I guess is the right word. It's important to remember as well when you're talking about punishment and reinforcement, you only know if punishment or reinforcement has been in place if the behaviour increases or decreases in the future. So you might put in place what you think is a reinforcement, maybe it's a high five or a great job or praise and the sticker, but if that doesn't result in the behaviour increasing, it wasn't a reinforcer, it wasn't effective, it didn't have any impact on the behaviour. Likewise with punishment, if you put in a reprimand, and you ever tell the child does something they're not supposed to, you tell them, no, don't do that, that's not right. If that behaviour continues to occur, then that reprimand wasn't a punishment. If the behaviour stops occurring, the reprimand was an effective punishment and it worked in terms of decreasing the behaviour itself. So then if we think about the fact that all behaviours are learned, people learn to behave in specific ways based on previous experience. We learn through a set of previous experiences which accumulate together to create some kind of learning history and general overview of things in the world that work and things in the world that don't. And just a basic knowledge of things that have happened will build upon our experience and create an overall learning history. We learn through observation, through exposure, through trial and error, and through practice. And whether or not a behaviour occurs again will depend on the consequence. If it's reinforced, it should occur again. If it's met with a neutral or punishing contingency, it's less likely to occur again. Remembering back to the principles of reinforcement and punishment. Behaviours are learnt through trial and error, repeated exposure, and watching others. If you watch someone else being reinforced, you're more likely to engage in that behaviour yourself. If you watch someone else tripping over and hurting themselves, you're less likely to engage in that behaviour yourself. If you're trying to complete a specific math test, you might trial a few different ways until you get the right way, and that trial and error is how you learn what's right and what's wrong, and how to get the reinforcement that you're seeking. So in terms of reinforcement, we need to think about the schedules of reinforcement. Behaviours are learnt quicker when they always result in the same outcome. So when you're first learning a brand new behaviour, it's reinforced every single time, and this continuous one-to-one level of reinforcement will result in the behaviour being learned quicker. If you think about a very small baby, they're often at home with mum all day, every day, and every kind of social interaction they engage in, eye contact, cooing, smiling, gurgling, reaching, they're reinforced every single time the child incurs with them. And that's why those behaviours increase, that's why those behaviours continue, because they're met with the reinforcement of mum's attention, mum's love and care. They will continue over and over again. However, when you get to slightly later in life, not all of your social interactions are met with reinforcement, but you're still going to continue to do them. Other examples include every time I eat chocolate, I enjoy it, so I'm going to continue to eat chocolate. I have not once yet eaten a bar of chocolate that I don't like, so as a result I'm reinforced every time I eat chocolate, and I'm going to continue to do so. Every time I put money into a Coke machine, I get a Coke can. I'm going to continue to use that vending machine. Every time I delegate a task to a co-worker, they do it. I'm going to continue to delegate tasks. All of those examples were met with reinforcement every single time I did them, and they also met the function which I needed them to. Eating chocolate meets the function of automatic reinforcement, again, the internal pleasure. Putting Coke money into the Coke machine is met with tangible reinforcement. Delegating tasks to co-workers is met with escape reinforcement. I'm reinforced by the function of my behavior, and I'm going to do it again. However, as I talked about briefly earlier, once behaviours are learned, they don't need to be reinforced every single time to continue. If we go back to the example of the baby that's gurgling and cooing, and every single time they make a noise, mum runs over to see how they are. By the time they get to the age of 2 or 3 and they're saying mama thousands and thousands of times a day, they're not going to get reinforced every time they say mama. But they're going to get reinforced often enough. They're going to continue engaging in that behaviour. They're going to continue to say mama. They're going to continue to interact. They're going to continue to engage, because every once in a while that behaviour works, and that's enough to maintain it. And this is what we call variable reinforcement or intermittent reinforcement. Now, these behaviours are really difficult to break or to change, because behaviours that are intermittently reinforced will persist over time, even if they're not met with reinforcement every single time. And while that's good for some of your positive behaviours, some of your appropriate social interactions, your appropriate behaviours that you've taught this child, it's going to persist even when they're not met with reinforcement every single time, it also unfortunately applies to inappropriate behaviours. And inappropriate behaviours may not be reinforced every single time they occur, but they're reinforced often enough that it still makes the behaviour worthwhile. Here's some other examples, and I'm eating my box of chocolate. 1 in 10 of these chocolates is a nasty coffee flavour. I really don't like the coffee flavour, but I'm still going to eat those chocolates, because for 9 of those 10 instances I'm reinforced by the yummy, lovely chocolate I like. That one chocolate I don't like isn't enough to stop me from eating the chocolates. If you think of your vending machine example, where every time you put the money in the slot you get something back, think about your gambling machines, your slot machines. People continue to do those because they got a big payout once upon a time. That payout might happen again, so they continue to do it. And this is a really key, commonly used example of intermittent reinforcement, where a behaviour, people will put hundreds of thousands of dollars into a slot machine on the basis that eventually they're going to get some kind of payout and it's going to be worth their money. If you think back to the example of delegating a work task, if I delegated a task to a colleague and they did a really bad job, but then I delegated it again and they did it next and they did a pretty good job, then it's a 50-50 chance I might still continue to delegate that job and just see how they do in the future. So how do we stop behaviours from occurring? Behaviours which are repeated or happen again are said to have been reinforced. Behaviours which cease to continue or don't happen again have been punished. So to stop a challenging behaviour from occurring, you need to identify why it's happening, the function, and what's maintaining it, the reinforcement. You can then determine how to replace the behaviour with a more appropriate alternative. You want to find something that meets the same function but has a different behaviour, and prevent the challenging behaviour from being effective by removing the reinforcement and implementing some kind of punishment system. So I need to point out at this point, punishment is not a dirty word. I know the term punishment has lots of negative connotations. It's often associated with really negative practices, really aversive, restrictive practices, and really questionable ethical decisions. For the purpose of today's topic, I'm not talking about punishment in that sense. I'm talking about punishment in the sense of ABA, and I simply mean the term punishment refers to reducing behaviour. It doesn't require aversive practices, doesn't require any kind of negative connotations. It's just a principle and procedure you can implement that will mean the behaviour is less likely to happen again in the future. So punishment is the process of behaviour reduction. It doesn't mean as if aversive practices and reactive measures. It can be as simple as removing the current reinforcement contingencies and replacing them with an appropriate alternative. It's important to note that you may not even need punishment to decrease a challenging behaviour. By applying proactive strategies that teach an appropriate replacement, to teach the support system, or to improve communication, you can reinforce these appropriate alternative behaviours, making the inappropriate behaviour unnecessary, and therefore it will stop. The best and most effective way to stop a behaviour from happening is to render it ineffective, to make it unuseful and unfunctional, and so the child will stop it and replace it with a more appropriate behaviour. We'll also want to review other trainings. If this is a concept that is less familiar to you, our Part 1 training goes into lots of detail into how to implement proactive strategies and how to teach the appropriate behaviours. I really recommend looking at those. There's also another training on functional communication, which is a really nice strategy in terms of reducing challenging behaviours through positive strategies. So when we look at the term punishment, we have two different types of punishment. The first is positive punishment, and this is when something is added to the environment immediately following the behaviour and will lead to a decrease in the behaviour happening again. So examples would be I speed on the motorway and get pulled over by the policeman. I'm given a speeding fine, so the speeding fine is added to my environment. I don't speed again, so my behaviour is punished because it didn't happen again. Another example in the classroom might be I finish my work really quickly and hand it in to the teacher. She gives me more work to do. So the additional work she's given me is added to the environment. I don't finish my work again quickly next time, because if I know now if I finish my work quickly, I'm going to be made to do more work. I'm less likely to complete my work fast in the future to avoid being given extra work. The other type of punishment we talk about is negative punishment. This is when something is removed from the environment immediately following the behaviour and will lead to a decrease in the behaviour happening again. Example might be I tell a joke at the pub, no one laughs, I don't tell a joke again. The fact that my joke is not met with the laughter I was hoping with, it's met with silence or the removal of attention, means that the joke itself was punished. I'm not going to do it again. I miss my 9 p.m. curfew and I'm late home. I'm grounded for a week, so the grounding is removing free access or removing the ability to freely go out and do what I want. I'm not going to be late home again. My behaviour of being late was punished by the removal of access to going out later in the week, and I'm going to stop doing it in the future. You have to remember, for all of these examples of punishment is only said to be effective if the future behaviour decreases. So, for example, if you place a child in detention for handing their homework in late, and they continue to be late in handing their homework in, the detention itself was not a punisher. In this case, you need to question the fairness of restricting access when it's not having the effect on the behaviour which you'd hoped. If punishment isn't working, you want to look again at the function of the behaviour and ensure your punishment matches this. You may be inadvertently reinforcing the behaviour, and we'll talk more about that later. So in the same way that we have schedules of reinforcement, I talked about earlier, continuous reinforcement or intermittent reinforcement, you can have the same schedule of punishment. For a punishment procedure to be effective, it needs to meet the same consequence every single time. So to truly reduce the behaviour, it needs to have the same outcome every single time. This is because if you think back to your schedules of reinforcement, in the same way that you teach a new behaviour with one-to-one schedules of reinforcement, you will break or change an old behaviour with one-to-one schedules of punishment. And the reason this is so important is because if you don't use punishment consistently, if sometimes you're going to follow through and sometimes you're not, all you're actually doing is putting the behaviour on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. And remember, behaviours that are intermittently reinforced are much harder to decrease. The child is going to learn, if I just keep persisting with this behaviour long enough, someone's going to give in, someone's going to get bored of this, someone's going to forget to follow through, and I'm going to get what I wanted in the first place. And those behaviours are really difficult to change. So you need to consider, in implementing any kind of punishment procedures, or any kind of behaviour change procedures really, how your reaction is affecting the behaviour. If a behaviour is still occurring, this means it's meeting some form of reinforcement. And the easiest way to stop the behaviour from occurring is to ensure it's not successful. It doesn't result in escape, it doesn't result in attention, it doesn't result in gaining access to specific items. It's not effective, it's not going to happen again. So thinking back to the function of behaviour, knowing why the behaviour is occurring will help you in how to manage it. You also want to consider the student's prerequisites. If the behaviour is happening for a specific reason, does the child have a more appropriate means to meet that same function within their repertoire? If the answer is no, can you teach them a more appropriate means? Can you be proactive in your teaching? Can you teach them replacement skills? Can you provide some proactive supports? And this will always be more effective in decreasing the behaviour than punishment, as they can teach the child what to do rather than what not to do. Provided you are being adequately proactive, punishment should only be needed as an infrequent measure to ensure the behaviour itself is not reinforced. You should never be relying on a punishment strategy as your sole method of decreasing behaviour. So I know I just said this, but you can't say it enough. Punishment or reactive measures should never stand alone. Punishment does not teach the behaviour, the child what to do. It says no, it says stop that, it says don't do that, but it doesn't teach your child any more appropriate means to do it. If you're continually telling the child not to do something or to stop doing something, but you haven't given them a more appropriate means to gain the same outcome or gain the same function, they're not going to be able to stop, because until that need is met through a more appropriate means, they're going to continue to engage in the behaviour because it serves a purpose, it serves a function, there is a reason behind it. So by not teaching an appropriate alternative, you leave the child with no choice but to pick their own alternative. If you look at the example here, I ate a huge box of chocolate last week and I put on 3 kilos. I've just realised how many chocolate examples I have in this video. Sorry. I didn't like the new number on the scales. I didn't like the fact that I put on 3 kilos, so I decided that I'm going to stop eating chocolates. I've been punished by that weight gain. I don't want to eat chocolate anymore. But I've cut chocolate out of my diet. I still have a real sweet tooth, so I think I'm going to eat ice cream instead. I mean, yes, my behaviour of eating chocolate has been punished. I'm not going to eat chocolate again for a week or so while I think about how awful I've been. But the fact that I've replaced chocolate with ice cream means that I'm still meeting that same function of a sweet tooth, but it's no more appropriate than my previous behaviour of chocolates. And this same thing applies for our children. If we let them pick their own alternative, we leave them no choice but to replace the behaviour with something of their own imagination. And this replacement behaviour they select may be no more appropriate than their previous choice of challenging behaviour. It may in fact be worse than their previous choice of challenging behaviour. Since the gaining weight was enough of a punishment to stop me eating chocolates, but the motivation is still there to eat sweet things. Simply removing chocolates did not solve the problem. What if, instead of cutting back the chocolate completely, I enrolled in the gym? I took classes on healthy eating, and I educated myself on the importance of my own health and well-being. These proactive strategies, these more appropriate replacements than eating chocolate, are going to be effective in stopping me from eating chocolate. They're also going to be effective in helping me make some better decisions and some better choices, and will hopefully result in me losing that weight again that I put on. It's a much more appropriate punishment system or appropriate way to change that behaviour than just eating ice cream instead. So before commencing any kind of intervention, you want to really consider if you've exhausted all the options. Like I said previously, punishment should be a last resort. You need to be sure that you've tried every proactive approach, that you've ticked all the boxes, that you've given the child every tool they need to be successful before you consider any kind of punishment procedure. You need to consider if the punishment you're considering fits the crime. Not only considering if it's functionally equivalent, because obviously putting in a punishment that doesn't result in the removal of the functional reinforcement, it's not going to be effective. It's just going to be a nasty way of dealing with a child that has no real means or no real result. But you also want to consider the harshness of the punishment in relation to the behaviour itself. A significant challenging behaviour which threatens the safety of self and others will warrant a quicker, firmer punishment intervention than a less challenging behaviour which is somewhat disruptive but no real harm for anyone. So you really want to make sure the procedures you're putting in place are warranted, that the behaviour is significant enough to consider these types of restrictive measures, and that you also want to really make sure that what you're putting in is really your last resort, that you've thought of all other alternatives. You also always want to make sure you involve the parents, not only for consent, but to consider how the behaviour is presenting at home and how it's dealt with at home. You may find that your response at school is different to your response at home, and as a result the behaviour is being intermittently reinforced through this inconsistent application or inconsistent follow-through. By simply making sure that everyone follows through in the same way and is more consistent, you could actually have a result or a decrease in the behaviour without the need for any kind of punishment at all. So it really is important before you implement any kind of punishment or behaviour reduction strategy that you really have thought about all other options before moving to this section. So, assuming you've thought about all of the options and this really is your last resort here, to decrease behaviours you need to consider 3 things. You want to think about the antecedent. What's happening before the behaviour, what triggers the behaviour, and when is the behaviour most likely to happen. These 3 things will help you to understand when punishment procedures may need to be put in place, and to also make sure that you're effectively, proactively supporting the child during these times. If you've identified triggers, you've identified specific times of day, you've identified what happens before, this will allow you to be proactive and should hopefully minimise the need for any kind of punishment at all. You also want to think about the behaviour. What does the behaviour look like? How do you define the behaviour? How do you know it's happening? How do you know it's occurring? What is the function of behaviour? Why is it happening? Why is the child doing this? And what appropriate alternatives can you teach? Once you know why the child is doing it, how can the child meet that same need in a more appropriate way? And then you want to think about the consequence. How is what I'm doing maintaining the behaviour? And am I being consistent? And note here that in terms of the consequence, you're often looking back at yourself. When you meet some kind of challenging behaviour with a child in school, it's not necessarily their fault. You need to look at your own teaching practices, your own methods of managing the children, your own methods of discipline or whatever it is you've got going on in your classroom management, and consider if what you're doing is being effective. And it's always much easier to change yourself than it is to change others, so making some simple changes in your own practices can have a really positive benefit on the classroom itself. So if we're looking at escape maintain behaviours, the easiest way to stop escape maintain behaviours from happening is to prevent escape. Make sure that regardless of what happens, that task is completed. And this might be a difficult one to follow through on in a classroom setting. When you've got 30 other children and a challenging behaviour is happening and you've got a lesson plan that requires you to continue to move and work through, it's going to be difficult to make sure that that one child follows through on the behaviour. This is where things like detention, after school work, additional homework, any way that you can give the child that same task and say, okay, you still need to do this. You didn't behave appropriately in class, but I still need you to complete this task. This isn't the appropriate way to get out of the behaviour. You want to make sure the completion is rewarded. So no matter how long it takes for the child to complete that task, you need to make sure it is worth it for them. If you give them additional homework, they come in and you just like, oh yeah, great, no worries. You don't acknowledge it, you don't acknowledge the effort that was put in. Their additional effort wasn't worth it, didn't meet with the reinforcement, they're again more likely to escape in the future because it's just easier to escape if you don't get anything in return. What's the point? Is it really worth it? And then thinking about your positive behaviour supports. Make sure you've got some visual supports in place that show the students these are the expectations, these are the rules I want you to follow, these are the activities we're going to do, these are the times you've got for fun things. So once you've done this really difficult math task and you've got a really great fun video to watch, building in that kind of escape under your control so the child doesn't need to access it through their own inappropriate means. Also thinking about communication. Does the child have a way to communicate, I don't want to do this, I don't like this is really hard, can you please help me, I need a break, I need some time to myself. Any of those appropriate means to say, actually at the moment this is just too difficult, can I please do something else instead? And making sure that when you're teaching these communication phrases, initially you want to be able to reinforce them every single time. I talked about this earlier, one-to-one schedule of reinforcement. The communication needs to be effective. Once a child understands the communication system and they can use it more fluidly by themselves, you can then start to fade out your reinforcement system. Also think about putting in some reward charts. Can you reward the child for more appropriate behaviours? If they're gaining access to preferred items, preferred events, preferred activities, the motivation to escape should be less because they're more motivated to engage in the appropriate behaviours and get the rewards than they are to engage in the inappropriate behaviours and access to escape. If you think about tangible maintained behaviours, you want to stop tangible maintained behaviours happening, you need to prevent access to tangibles. You need to ensure the challenging behaviour never results in access to the preferred item or activity. You need to ensure there's a clear division between the challenging behaviour and the next preferred event. So if a child is engaging in challenging, disruptive behaviour and that's immediately followed by a fun activity, you might be inadvertently reinforcing this behaviour when you didn't really mean to. So you want to make sure that any kind of challenging behaviours, there's a brief offset, a brief stop, a brief pause, the child follows some other instruction before they move on to the preferred activity. So there's not that direct link between I did something really awful but I still got to have that fun activity at the end, so maybe it doesn't matter. Thinking back to your example of the playground that I gave earlier, the child that snatches the toy and gains access to the tangible, if someone came up and took that tangible item back and gave it to their peer and said, no, you need to ask your friends if you want to borrow toys, that's punished the behaviour. You've stopped their access to the behaviour, you've stopped the behaviour, you should hopefully have stopped the behaviour from occurring in the future. You want to ensure there's appropriate behaviour is rewarded. So can you give free access to preferred items every so often? Everything the child wants they have to work for, it can become really hard, really demoralising, and really demotivating. If everything you want to do, someone says, okay, first do this first. Or, yeah, okay, you can only have ice cream if you eat your dinner. Or you can only go to the park if you tidy your bedroom. If you have to work for everything, then it's kind of difficult, it's kind of boring, it's kind of monotonous. If you can give free access to things sometimes, and the child knows that sometimes I just get these really great things just because, the motivation to engage in inappropriate behaviours will decrease because the child will know that sometimes they get things for fun, sometimes they get things for free, and I don't need to do these really difficult, challenging behaviours because I'm going to get these fun rewards anyway. And then you're saying positive behaviour supports that I talked about earlier. Visual supports, making sure you're making it clear to the children when they can access those preferred items, when there's items to come, making sure there's some really clear rules of what you expect the child to do. Raise your hands, be nice to your friends, share with your friends, all those kind of things. Making sure the child has the appropriate communication. Do they have the language to ask for things they want? Do they have the language to make their wants and needs known? Do they have the functional communications to ask for help, to ask for more time, to say I'm not ready? Any of those things that are way more appropriate than engaging in some kind of behaviour challenges. And then your reward chart. Again, if you can make access to those preferred items under your control, under your contingencies, you can gain access to this preferred item if you do your 10 worksheets and you're going to get a sticker for each worksheet. It brings the behaviour back under your control, and it means the child knows they don't need to engage in inappropriate behaviour to gain access to the tangible items. They need to follow the rules, earn their stars, earn their rewards, make appropriate requests, and then they will get access to the item itself. Attention maintain behaviours. Again, if a behaviour is occurring to gain access to attention, you can stop it by preventing access to attention. Don't react. Don't make a response. Don't say anything. Don't reprimand. Don't tell the child not to do. Remain neutral and calm. You want to be really wary of facial expressions and body language. Some children can really read your body language, and even if you're not saying anything, you can tell by the look in your face that you're somewhat annoyed, and that reaction in itself is enough to know that, yep, I got a response, I got what I needed. You also want to consider the classroom setup. If you've got a student who is motivated by attention from their peers, can you remove them away from that peer group? Can you stop them from having that reaction? Can you kind of manage or maintain the behaviours of the peers? Can you tell them that it's not appropriate to laugh at your friends when they do silly jokes, but every time you laugh at your friends when you do silly jokes, you're going to lose a star or you're going to lose a reward, and that will stop the behaviour of the students laughing and should stop the other behaviour because they're no longer getting the response or reaction they want. You also want to ensure that appropriate behaviour is rewarded. Make sure you're giving more attention for appropriate behaviour. If the child is getting adequate attention throughout the day, adequate interaction from those around them, they shouldn't need to engage in inappropriate behaviour to get those responses, because they should be getting them for free through way more appropriate means. And again, your positive supports, visual supports, making sure it's clear when there's when there's time to engage in talk with peers and when there's not time to. Making it clear that I raise my hand to make a request, I ask for help if I need it. Communication, making sure they have the appropriate ways of gaining attention. They know how to go up to their peers, how to greet their peers, how to say hi, how to start a conversation, how to engage with others. Make sure they have those social skills that are necessary to maintain the attention that they're looking for. And again, reward charts, rewarding the children for the appropriate behaviours so they can gain access to the attention they're looking for. It's important to note with all of these proactive strategies, all of these positive behaviour supports, I know I'm repeating myself a few times, but these positive supports will only be effective if you're making sure the challenging behaviour isn't met with reinforcement. So you can put in as many positive supports as you want, you can really focus on reinforcing the positive behaviour, but if the inappropriate challenging behaviour is still met with reinforcement, it's still going to happen. So you really need to make sure you're shifting the balance between only positive behaviours are reinforced, challenging behaviours are never met with that reinforcement, and that's how you're going to make the shift from one to the other. And then finally, automatically maintain behaviours. These ones are slightly more difficult to engage with or to punish because the behaviours themselves are reinforcing. By the time the child has done the behaviour, they've got the reinforcement themselves because it's that great internal sensation that they were seeking. But you want to think about, can you dull the preferred sensation anyway? Can you mask the sensation, overshadow the sensation, kind of minimize the effect it has on the child and whatever it is they're seeking? An example might be, I worked with a student previously who, I don't know how he did it, but he used to get his hands together and make this kind of weird squelching noise by like clapping his hands together, and he would do it all day, every day. It was really consistent, really persistent, really quite disruptive to him and his learning. And we actually ended up putting on some gloves for him, and the behaviour stopped because he didn't get that same kind of automatic feedback, that same kind of sensation that he would have done before. You also want to make sure in doing this that you're ensuring appropriate behaviour is rewarded. Can you make sure that the child is getting the access to that kind of sensation they're seeking through more appropriate ways? This might be going through an OT or getting some kind of other support, and really looking at kind of sensory regulation, sensory processing, really helping the children to regulate their own senses and feelings, and see if you can shift the motivation to create a different focus. Can you give the child a more appropriate way to engage in that same kind of sensory seeking without it being a behaviour challenge? And again, positive supports. Make sure you're scheduling in visual supports to show when access to those preferred activities are. If there's a child that has high levels of sensory seeking behaviour, scheduling in times when they can go and play on the trampoline, they can go and play on the therapy ball, they can play with the sensory bins, building that into your day so that, again, you don't need to engage in the inappropriate challenging behaviour because I know that at regular points in my day I'm going to get access to this preferred item anyway. putting in the communication, making sure the child can make the request, but I need a bit of time to myself, I need to decompress, I need to de-stress, I need to do whatever it is that's necessary. And the reward charts, can they work towards access for those preferred items, those preferred sensations, through engagement in appropriate behaviours? Now we're going to talk through a few actual strategies in terms of things that you can do to decrease challenging behaviour and how they'll be used in the classroom. So this first one here is your response cost. So response cost refers to the removal of a preferred item, activity or event following a challenging behaviour. It might be loss of pocket money, it might be loss of a star on a reward chart, it might be loss of a classroom privileges, it might be detention or loss of break time. Now, in implementing a response cost, you want to make sure that the behaviour itself functions for tangible items. Removing pocket money or removing a reward chart or removing a privilege is not going to have any kind of impact on the child if that privilege or reward chart wasn't motivating in the first place. If the privilege was to take the roll call back to the school office, and the child actually didn't want to take the roll call back to the school office anyway, they're not going to care that they've lost the privileges in any shape or form. It's not going to have a functional effect on the behaviour. If the behaviour is serving for escape, detention, or sending a child out of the room, or removing them from the scenario, it's actually going to reinforce the behaviour. You're going to reinforce that challenging behaviour by allowing them to escape at that time. And again, it's not going to have any kind of effect on the behaviour in terms of what you're looking for and what you're hoping to achieve. So when you're putting in a response cost, you need to really carefully consider what the function of behaviour is and ensure that whatever it is you're removing or taking away from the child is meaningful to them. It's going to have an effect on them. Ideally, with a response cost, it should only have to happen once or twice, and the loss of that pocket money once or twice should be so significant that the child won't engage in the behaviour again. Remember, that's what's important. You're aiming to stop the child from engaging in the challenging behaviour. And if a response cost doesn't stop the child engaging in challenging behaviour, it's not an effective punishment. And you also want to think about what other proactive strategies you have in place to support the child. So considerations. Was the function of the behaviour to access a tangible item? If the answer is no, a response cost or removal of that item is going to have limited impact on the child. Can the student access their preferred item in other, more appropriate ways? Again, if the answer is no, removing the item following a challenging behaviour hasn't taught them what to do. It hasn't taught them, okay, I shouldn't have done that, that was a bad choice, but instead I could do A, B and C. If they haven't got A, B and C in their repertoire, they're going to continue to engage in the bad choice because they've got no other means of gaining access to that item. And thinking about, can you be consistent? Will you do the same thing every single time? Will others follow through in the same way? Response costs can be really difficult for parents to follow through on. If you've got the child in the supermarket kicking and screaming on the floor and mum and dad give lollies because they just need you to be quiet. It's really embarrassing. Everyone's looking at me. You're causing a huge scene. Please, here, have these lollies. You've reinforced that behaviour. You're going to make the behaviour of screaming and kicking and crying in the shops happen more often. And unless you know that parents and other people in that child's life can be consistent and follow through in the same way, I would really caution against any kind of punishment. If you can't do it consistently, you can't do it the same way every time, it's better just not to do it at all. Another type of punishment procedure is planned ignore. So this is removing your attention following the challenging behaviour. Now, by planned ignore, I mean you're ignoring the behaviour. You're not ignoring the child, you're not depriving them of attention for extended periods of time, you're not letting them get into any kind of difficult situations because you're not watching and you're not paying attention. You're just not reacting to the behaviour itself. You can remain neutral, you can walk away, and minimise your reprimands while maximising your praise. So making sure that you're giving that attention for the positives, not giving it for the negatives. Considerations you want to think about: was the function of the behaviour to access attention? If it's not, then planned ignore is not going to have any effect. If the function of the behaviour is to gain your attention, yeah, definitely planned ignore is a great way to remove that attention and ensure the child is not getting attention. But if the behaviour serves to escape or to avoid attention or to gain access to tangible items, while you're ignoring that child and ignoring that behaviour, they've escaped your attention. They've probably escaped the work because you're not watching them and not seeing what they're doing. And they might be able to get up and get access to a preferred item for free because you're not paying as much attention to them as you would do normally. In any one of those scenarios, you've reinforced the behaviour by engaging in a planned ignore. You need to be really careful that you're only doing it in the appropriate times. You also want to think about when you're putting in a planned ignore, is enough attention being given to the child at other times of the day? You can get into a really tricky situation with punishment procedures whereby if you're constantly removing the reinforcement and the child isn't gaining enough access to that reinforcement, that the behaviour will actually increase. If the child is engaging in a challenging behaviour to gain attention and you're going to remove attention for that challenging behaviour, you need to make sure there's enough attention given at other times throughout the day. In fact, you need to make sure there's more attention given at other times throughout the day, so the child is still getting access to attention. They're still gaining that motivating item, that motivating access, but they're not getting it through the challenging behaviour. Because if all you do is remove your attention, you're actually going to see an escalation in the behaviour, because the child still needs your attention. They still want your attention. If I'm not getting it any other way, I'm going to continue to escalate my behaviours until eventually you attend to me and do something. And attention maintained behaviours can be really difficult, because a lot of children will very soon figure out that if I just escalate my behaviour far enough to do something dangerous or something silly, someone's going to have to stop me, because they're not going to let me get hurt. They're not going to let me, injure myself. Someone is going to eventually step in if I just push this far enough. So again, you want to think about, can you be insistent in your approach? Will you do the same thing every time? Will others follow through in the same way? Planned ignore, again, is really difficult for parents. It's really hard to ignore your child when they're upset, when they're crying. But if they're doing it to gain your attention, it's something you need to work through and teach them more appropriate alternatives. But again, any kind of punishment that you're implementing, you need to make sure you're being consistent across settings, across scenarios. Another form of punishment is continued demand. So continue the expectation to complete the task regardless of the behaviour. This could be giving an extension on homework or requiring it the next day, giving a detention, requiring the homework to be completed before leaving, making the student continue the work task while the rest of the class moves on to do another activity. So any one of these examples, you're requiring the student to continue to complete the work regardless of the challenging behaviours. Considerations. Was the function of behaviour to escape? So obviously giving a detention or requiring the homework to be completed later in the day, or requiring the child to continue working during the rest of the class, if the behaviour functions for escape, then yes, it's going to work. But if the behaviour functioned to avoid something that's happening in the classroom, or to avoid going home, or to avoid doing the activity that's coming up next because they don't like it or they don't want to do it, then any of these extensions or adaptations, again, may actually reinforce the behaviour rather than punish it. You want to consider how much attention you're giving during this continued demand. For some children, when you continue the demand, you're going to have to give additional attention. You're going to have to tell the child, I need you to do this is why I need you to do it. You have to keep checking in, making sure they're doing it, making sure they're doing their work. You have to follow through. You might have to give some kind of prompts and support to help them through it. There can be a lot of attention involved in a continued demand, and if there is any kind of attention-related component to the behaviour, the process of following through and continuing the demand might actually reinforce it. If this is the case, you need to think of some way you can continue the demand without giving the additional attention. So maybe you can write down, this is what I need you to do, I'll come and talk to you when you're finished. And you don't re-engage with the child until they've finished. By that way, you've continued the demand, but you've also removed the reinforcement. You also want to think about if an appropriate alternative is being taught. Can the child make a request for a break, to say it's too hard, to say they don't want to say they don't like it, any of those things. If they have a more appropriate way of escaping or avoiding the activity. And again, making sure you can be consistent. Escape maintained behaviours can be really hard to follow through on, because you have time constraints in the day. There's going to become a time in the day when actually end of school has happened and you still haven't completed that work. You need to have a plan to make sure you know how to follow through on those. I think it's important to also consider, for all of these punishment procedures, that sometimes behaviours are going to get worse before they get better. And that doesn't necessarily mean that what you're doing isn't working. If you think about any behaviour that you've engaged in previously, you do it because it meets reinforcement. You do it because it's continued to meet reinforcement on a regular basis, and you know that if I keep doing it long enough, I'm going to get that reinforcement. If someone removes that reinforcement from you, I'm going to keep doing the behaviour for a little while because, my behaviour wasn't reinforced every single time previously, so I'll just keep going for a little bit and I'll see if it happens. A couple of days go past and I still haven't reached the reinforcement I was hoping for, so I'm going to up my game. I'm going to make things worse. I'm going to be more dramatic. I'm going to be more challenging. I'm going to be more difficult, more overt in my behaviour, and see if that gets the result I want. And it's often at this point that people give in, because the behaviour's gotten worse, the behaviour's spiked. We call it an extinction burst. There's a significant increase in the behaviour. Oh my gosh, it must mean I'm doing something wrong. It doesn't. It means the child is trying to seek the reinforcement that you've removed. It actually means it's working. It actually means you've got the right function, you've removed the right reinforcer, and the child is trying to find another way to get access to that reinforcement. If you continue at this point, another day or so, and you should see the behaviour significantly decrease. As long as you can work through that extinction burst, you can work through that increase in challenging behaviour, you will see a decrease on the other side. It's really important that any implementation you're putting in, you're able to follow through, because if you get to that extinction burst and the behaviour is more challenging than you expected, or more difficult than you expected, or lasts longer than you expected, and you can't follow through for whatever reason, all you've now done is reinforce that increased, higher challenging behaviour. And as a result, next time round, the child's going to engage in that increased, higher challenging behaviour because it worked last time. So really consider your ability to follow through when you're putting in any of these practices. So the final thing I want to talk about to you today is how you are going to track the success of your behaviour. You want to make sure that you're taking some data. You need to know that what you're doing is working, because if the implementation or the strategies you're putting in place aren't decreasing the behaviour, then they're actually somewhat unfair and somewhat unethical. To continue to put in procedures that aren't working is not fair on the child. So to know that a behaviour is working, you need to have some kind of data, some kind of measure that shows you this is how much the behaviour is happening before I started to intervene, this is how much the behaviour is happening now, and I can see the behaviour is decreasing. And this might just be a simple spot check. Maybe one day a week you take a frequency count on how often the behaviour occurs, or you take a duration on how long the behaviour lasts, and each week you check back in on that same measure just to make sure that the behaviour is going down as you expect it to. You also want to think about how far does the behaviour need to go. Do you need to decrease the behaviour to zero? If it's a significant challenge in behaviour that poses a risk to self or others, then yeah, maybe you do need to decrease it to zero. But if the behaviour doesn't need to decrease to zero, what's enough? Do we need to decrease it to maybe one time a day or once a week? Or think about how much you'd expect the behaviour to happen on a typical day. Think about where the behaviour currently is. If the behaviour is currently at 10, 20, 30 times a day, maybe a decrease to 5 a day would be enough. If the behaviour is currently only at 5 a day, a decrease to 1 time a day would be more appropriate. So thinking about what your expectation is, how you know it's going to work, what you're going to work towards. You also want to think about what you're going to do if the behaviour doesn't decrease. If you've given it a couple of weeks and you've been really consistent, you've really followed through, you're sure that everyone else is following through in the same way, and it still isn't working, you need to reassess. You need to check if you've got the right function of behaviour, if the intervention you've selected is correct, and if your practice strategies are really being taught. The behaviour isn't going to decrease unless you have those practice strategies in place. And often that's the first thing you need to look at if a behaviour strategy isn't working as you hoped. And as I said, make sure you're considering the ethical and procedural considerations for extended use of punishment. Punishment isn't something that should be used consistently forever and ever. It's something you should use for a short burst to decrease the behaviour, and then you can teach positive practice strategies to stop the behaviour from happening again. Punishment isn't something you should be using on a daily basis. It's something that should be used really sparingly, and if you are continuing to use it over and over again without any effective results, you need to really consider what you're doing and why. So defining success, so talking a little bit more about the level of behaviour that you're hoping for. The amount of disruption the behaviour causes will define how much the behaviour needs to decrease. You want to think about how much is enough to decrease. Is 50% enough? Is a 10% decrease enough? Think about how often the behaviour occurs in other children. I mean, the behaviour itself might not be inappropriate. All children have bad days where they, find things a little bit difficult and maybe protest a little bit or storm out of the room because it's hard. You're not expecting a behaviour to never ever happen, but you're expecting it not to happen at a level that's disrupting everyone else. You want to think about if the behaviour is dangerous and needs to stop completely. If it does, you need to intervene really quickly, and I suggest you get the support of a behaviour specialist. They can help you ensure that the practices you're putting in place are safe and are going to support the child. And you want to consider the behaviour in other environments. If the behaviour is happening at school and at home and at Nana's house, thinking about how you can support the child through all of these scenarios and make sure that everyone is being consistent and effective in their approach. When you're thinking about your measurement of the data, there are lots of different ways in which you can measure the data. You maybe want to look at the frequency. How often is it happening? Does it happen once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day? You may want to consider the duration. A behaviour might only happen once a day, but it's lasting for 1-2 hours at a time, then the duration is an important measure. You might want to think about the intensity. The intensity of behaviour can vary. An aggressive behaviour that involves someone being physically hurt and requiring first aid is very different to an aggressive behaviour where someone is just pushed out the way and moved over. So thinking about, okay, maybe the frequency of my behaviour hasn't decreased, but the intensity might have decreased. And really think about what's the important element of this behaviour you want to decrease. You want to think about how often the behaviour occurred before intervention, so you've got some kind of measurement to see how effective your intervention has been, and think about how you're going to score the data. Are you going to do it all day, every day, or would a sample suffice? Can you just do it for an hour at a time? If the behaviour only really occurs in math lesson, only take the data in math lesson. If the behaviour only really occurs in the session after lunch, only take it in that session. Really thinking about when the data needs to be done so you can maximise your time and make sure you're using it appropriately. And then, can you measure a related increase in appropriate behaviour? So if you're trying to decrease one behaviour, chances are you're trying to increase another behaviour. And can you think about measuring this so you can see the success if one decreases, the other will increase? In terms of making changes with your intervention, if the behaviour has not started to decrease within 2 weeks, or if the behaviour shows variation across days and weeks, this would suggest that your intervention is not effective and you need to make some kind of changes. The 2 weeks is just a guideline. If you've got a really challenging behaviour that poses a risk for self and others, I probably wouldn't be waiting 2 weeks before I make some kind of changes. Punishment is not fair or appropriate if it does not work. Consider your proactive replacement strategies, consider the consistency, and reassess your function. So in terms of putting all of it together, you want to create a plan. It's really important in putting in any kind of behaviour intervention that you have a solid plan before you're doing it, so you've considered all of the elements before you start. You want to think about which of your behaviours is the highest priority, which one happens most, lasts the longest, and disrupts the class most frequently. Or is there one that poses a high risk of danger? You want to prioritise these target behaviours and focus on these first. I'd recommend picking just 1 or 2 behaviours and then working your way through the list as you become successful. You want to think about when the behaviour typically occurs and what the triggers are to it. You want to think about what the possible function of the behaviour is, if you need to gather more information to confirm this. You want to think about strategies that could support the student in decreasing the behaviour. Do you need to teach appropriate replacements, minimise the behaviour from occurring in the first place? Remember, these should always be your first choice. I would recommend starting on these practice strategies before putting anything else in place, as these in and of themselves, when applied correctly, can actually decrease the behaviour. You want to think about considering the implementation of the strategy. Who will implement it? How will it be implemented? And do you need to consult with parents before doing so? You want to think about how you respond if the behaviour does occur. How are you going to minimise reinforcement? And you need to consider the safety of the student themselves or others around them. And then finally, think about how you will track the progress. How can you be sure the strategy is working, and how often do you need to review it? So in summary, proactive intervention should always be your first choice. Always make sure that this is what you're starting with. You're teaching appropriate replacements, you're teaching appropriate alternatives. You want to ensure the interventions you're using are linked directly to the function of the behaviour. And then make sure when you're implementing punishment procedures, you ensure careful consideration of the function and monitor its success. So that is it for today. If you have any questions, queries, responses, please feel free to email me on my address here. This is a NISA approved training and will give you 1 accredited hour of training. If you purchase that option in the payment package, please send me an email with your invoice for the receipt, a certificate of your completion of the online webinar, and there is a very short questionnaire to go through just to make sure that you've listened to the webinar in its entirety, and I can then send you a certificate. Thank you for your time today, and I hope you've enjoyed the training.